Okay, here we go. New imperialism and global patterns. What makes a country powerful? So this is multiple chapters kind of molded together, and you can kind of think of this as prelude to World War One. So as you're kind of going through this, um, be thinking about these are the main causes of World War One. There's long term, and so this is when we look at them, the things to keep in mind. So you've got militarism, this competition to build bigger, more weapons and to build up your armies, and also to prove how strong you are. An alliance system where you get two sides in Europe of competing gangs. And through some of this, hopefully, you can start to see why they build these alliances. Imperialism, this competition over colonies and to get new businesses, and then nationalism, this fierce pride in one's country that we're better than you are, our stuff is cooler than your stuff. So all that stuff is there. Plus, we've got all these other things that are underlying, and some of that is the history and the spark that we're talking about here is going to help you understand World War One a little bit better. So if we look at building overseas empires, were Western nations right to build imperial empires? What were the causes? Why it spread so quickly? And then the imperial governments that ruled over these. So if we look at motives, one is we need to understand what imperialism is. So it's the domination of one country over the political, economic, and cultural life of another country or an entire region. So in this case, mostly Africa and Asia are the places that we're talking about. So the reason why, one is economic interests. With these European countries industrializing, they need raw materials to help continue to fuel that industrialization. The other thing is for new markets and investments. Once you get pretty good at making stuff, sooner or later you need to find new people to buy your stuff, and so that's part of it. When we look at political and military motives, especially in this industrialization age, with trade overseas, because we have global trade, having bases where you can refuel and get coal and supplies and those types of things, that's very attractive. And the other thing is to halt the expansion of others. I mean, as Africa begins to get gobbled up and Asia begins to get gobbled up, countries are afraid that they're going to lose out, and so they want to make sure that Germany doesn't want France to get too big, or Great Britain doesn't want France to get too big, and so there's this competition that's going on. And then also for the aspect of national prestige, whoever tallies the most colonies can say, look, we got more colonies than you do, we're better than you are. So all those things are kind of going on. So the other thing too is the thinking process behind this is there is some humanitarian and religious aspects of this. Religiously, Westerners feel the need to Christianize these groups to save their souls. Also, from a humanitarian aspect, they see all the things that Western countries have developed, medicine, law, as very good things, which they are, that need to be spread to other people. So this idea of a white man's burden, which this cartoon shows, is that the United States and Great Britain, it's their duty to carry these wild, native, backwards people to civilization. And so there's an element of kind of superiority that's in this, where we just think we're better and everybody needs to be like us. So that's in there too, which is the social Darwinism. The idea that some races are superior to other ones, and that in order for the species to continue to grow and get better, needed to make sure that weaker species or races were eliminated or brought to civilization. So if we look at the rapid spread of it, I mean, one is these non-Western states that they're just not very strong, and they're not very strong for a couple of different reasons. One is they're older in some cases, and they're just in decline. The other thing is when we look at Africa, Africa is greatly weakened by the slave trade. The other thing is if you're going to define power by the size of your military and how many factories and how much stuff you can produce, we just have more, Western nations have more stuff of that. So the strong economies, the organized governments, armies, navies, modern technology, medical knowledge, all those things kind of make it so that this is going to be a rapid spread. Now, this doesn't all go smoothly. these people, indigenous peoples, aren't interested in being run and ruled and dominated by another group of people, so they resist that. There's also criticism at home. Not everybody is really all that fired up about imperialism. They see the inherent maybe racism that's in there and the air of superiority, and they see these fightings over these countries and how it impacts them and the aggression, and they don't like it. They think it's a bad thing, and in some cases they think it's an immoral thing. So there's different forms. You don't really have to worry about these too much. These are just the different ways that they formed these colonies and ruled over these colonies. And so again, here's another example: protectorates, spheres of influence. Don't really worry too much about that. It's just the way that they're going to divide up the world and how they're going to control those worlds and the different ways and forms that this imperialism takes. So one of the things that does come out of this is sooner or later these European nations realize we are headed for trouble. So they call the Berlin Conference. They meet in Berlin, Germany. They sit down and they talk about ways that they're going to avoid war and bloodshed. They also set rules up for this new game of imperialism. How do you determine what land is yours? How are we going to make sure that we avoid going to war over this? One of the things that you see come out of this, though, is the wars in the Congo. So you begin to see what's going to happen as these places gobble these countries up. They exploit the resources and the people. There's brutal treatment because, again, they see these individuals from Africa as being less than, and in some cases not even really human or less than 100% human. And so it makes it okay to do some of these things that they do. And that's going to be a theme that we're going to see throughout. So if we look at this, and Africa is the perfect example, Africa gets gobbled and divided up relatively quickly. So when you look at independent nations, there are the gray colors. We've got Liberia that's left, and the Empire of Ethiopia that's left, and the rest of this massive continent of Africa has been divided up. So when we also look at this, there's a couple other things that factor in. So part of the reason Ethiopia is able to avoid this is they westernized and they were Christian. Liberia had U.S. support. That's how they were able to survive. When we look at new African elites and attempts to westernize, really what's going to come out of this is these things are going to further divide the people. When we look at Africa, those people who align themselves with the Europeans and the Westerners raise to a new status level, and so that gives them a superior social position just because of their close alliance. And so then you get people divided up against each other, those who are sellouts and those who are not sellouts. And so that happens. The other thing is attempting to westernize. That's going to divide people too. There are some people in Africa who say we should become like the Europeans so that way we can drive them out of the country. And other people say, well, we don't want to sell out that way either. We want to maintain our own culture and our own heritage. And so we don't want to give up who we are so that we can be like them, because we're not them. We are we. And that's going to lead to all kinds of problems. But also with industrialization, what you see is a quick growth in population. As medicine and food increases, the population pops up, and that's going to lead to a desire for more reforms. The other problem that you run into is to westernize, you have to industrialize and modernize and build railroads. That's expensive. These countries are going to go heavily into debt, and that's going to be used as leverage to keep these places under the thumb of these European nations. The other thing you see is exploiting diversity and creating diversity. So one of the ways that colonists or the colonizers are able, again, to have this imperialism is by dividing people up. And so in India, they can take advantage of the diversity, the religious and the ethnic and the cultural diversity, and split them up against each other. And in some cases, for example, Rwanda, they're able to create ways to split them up in these artificial categories and groupings, and it's going to lead to all kinds of atrocities. This is a system whereby the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. These colonized countries, the cash crops, it's going to weaken their ability to have a strong economy later. And then also these Europeans are able to force them to sign these unequal treaties that are going to bind them for the future. Japan modernizes, so that's going to set things up for really post World War I and into World War II. When the United States goes in to Japan, they realize that they're way behind the world. They hurry up and industrialize as quickly as they can. They create a navy that's modeled after the British, an army after the Prussians, industry and government a little bit based on the United States. And what that does is it's able to turn them around so that when they fight in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, they're able to defeat what's supposedly supposed to be a superior Russian people, and they have emerged onto the world stage as a real player. And that's going to set up an interesting dynamic between Japan and the United States here that we'll probably go into a little bit more detail with next year in U.S. history. So here are some different effects of imperialism. Culturally, it impacts these places that are under European control. Politically, it changes things up as well as it does economically. Some of these things are changes for the better, some of these are changes for the worse, and some are somewhere in between. So it just depends. But these are the ways that imperialism really radically changes and makes these places different than they were before. So one of the other things that we see out of this is self-rule. So some of these places are allowed to gain their own independence. And what this is, it's a modern map of the Commonwealth Games. These are all places that were aligned with Great Britain at some point in history. And just like we have like the U.S. Championships, they have the Commonwealth Games. They continue to play cricket matches against each other. So it's just kind of interesting how this past 100 years or more ago is tied into the present. So even some of these places like Australia and Canada, they consider the Queen of England the queen of their country as well. So they recognize her as a monarch of Australia and the monarch over Canada. So even though they're independent and they have self-rule, they still align themselves with Great Britain in their past history. So if we look at the United States, they get into the game with the Spanish-American War. We defeat the Spanish. We pick up all kinds of territories. And then all of a sudden, we get into the business of imperialism as well. We pick up the Philippines. We don't want to let them go because that's a good stopping off point for trade in China. Especially in Latin America, we exert our influence. We don't want foreign countries in Latin American business. And so we kind of take over, and through investment and interference, we really become the imperialistic power in the Western Hemisphere. And the Monroe Doctrine just officially kind of recognizes us as the police force for the Western Hemisphere, that we're going to protect these places and we'll make sure that there's law and order. And the Roosevelt Corollary goes on to say that we'll also make sure that they pay their debts and do all those things. Whether they like it or not, we'll make sure it gets done. So again, if you look at imperialism, the analogy of the uninvited house guest, hopefully this is just trying to get you to think of this from the perspective of those who are living in imperialistic countries. They're taken over by these other Western European powers, and really the whole thing is about taking what they have and using it for your own use, and really leaving them with nothing at the end of this, and then they have to rebuild. And then on top of that, they endure decades or nearly a century of being told that everything you are is wrong. And if you want to become advanced, if you want to become modern, if you want to become like real people, then you have to conform to our set of ideas and rules and expectations. And it just has caused lots of conflict. And so a lot of the problems in the world today come from this imperialism, just because it sets these places up to fail, and they've had to overcome this, and they're still struggling to deal with the after effects of imperialization.